and thank you for joining the Hamilton Hood Foundation for a special presentation on Places of Remembrance, a celebration of Black burial grounds by Abra Lee, founder of Conquer the Soil. I am Yamona Pierce, founder of the Hamilton Hood Foundation, and our conversation today will explore historic Black cemeteries as an archive with the many untold stories and legacies just waiting to be documented. Our guest, Abra Lee, is a national speaker, writer, and founder of Conquer the Soil, a community that combines history, art, fashion, and culture to expand the understanding of ornamental horticulture. She has spent a whole lot of time in the dirt as a municipal arborist, extension agent, and airport landscape manager, and more. Lee is a graduate of Auburn University College of Agriculture and an alumna of the Longwood Gardens Society of Fellows, a global network of public horticulture professionals. Without further ado, I welcome and introduce to you Abra Lee.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Yamona, and hello to everyone watching this presentation today. This is three of my favorite subjects, which is history, Black culture, and cemeteries, a reason to celebrate. The erasure of Black people and Black America in cemeteries started long before the Great Migration of Black people from the South returning to the North, or actually going to the North to seek better lives for themselves. When our ancestors left the South, they often left behind their ancestral land, the land that their family had been on for generations. And by making those trips, they also had to, unfortunately, abandon many times the family cemetery. And they made this journey to the North for many reasons, most of the time fleeing for their safety, for their life, and for a better opportunity at living. I mentioned that erasure started long before the Great Migration, and it started early, very early in the 1600s in places like New York City. This is a place where enslaved and free African Americans, and also African immigrants to the city, Black people from the diaspora, did not have a place to bury their loved ones. The city did not allot land for that. So in the late 1600s, the city planners created a 5-block burial ground in what today is Manhattan. And we can see that circled here on the chart. And for the next 100 years, between 15 to 20,000 Black Americans, formerly enslaved free African Americans, were buried in this plot. In around 1794, the city of New York begins to expand, and now the city wants that land back, and they decide to shut down this cemetery. And when they shut it down, they drop 25 feet of dirt on top of the loved ones, the ancestors, these folks' grounds where they're celebrating and rejoicing of the people that they've lost that have gone on to the afterlife. And they did this because they wanted to expand the area for housing in New York City for this growing mecca of the United States of America. And it wasn't until the 1990s that these families, these Black people, these men, these women, these children were remembered again. And it was all because of a federal project in New York where the United States government was using that same plot of land to build a new building, and they had to do an archaeological survey as part of the building process. And what they discovered under there 200 years later, so from 1794 to around 1994, was just shocking, unbelievable, in the best and in the worst way. And this place of land has now become what we call the National African American Burial Ground. What archivists and archaeologists were able to discover were these what we call experienced objects, objects that were used by the loved ones of the people in the cemetery. So this was things like beads. They found coins over their eye sockets. They found pieces of broken pottery, which was representative of the types of bowls and plates that the ancestors would have used, and it was broken to make sure that the ancestors accepted their new life in the afterlife, in this other world, in heaven, and didn't try to return home and follow the living back home. So when they did this, this was verification that this erasure had happened to our ancestors in New York, and it continues to happen today. But fortunately, we can do something about it. Cemeteries, as the saying goes, that sorrow comes in the night, but joy will come in the morning, are places and were places of social gathering and celebration and spiritual elation. And before our culture started to be erased, and before we started to assimilate more into the mainstream American society, we took many of our cues from West Africa, particularly places like the Congo, where many of our ancestors came from in bondage. And these are examples of what academics like Gray Gundaker call spiritual glitter artifacts of African Americans and Black people to connect and remember with their loved ones. This includes things like clocks, which you see in the bottom corner, that may be set to the time that the loved one passed away. It may also be set to noon, the time of the reckoning hour when a Christ would come back. Also, things like I mentioned before, the experience objects, things that you would need in the afterlife, your pots and pans, your cooking utensils, maybe a favorite cup of yours. Also, pipes used as conduits to make messages clear to the deceased and to the loved ones. And also, there were things like jugs filled with water. Water was another spiritual conduit to our ancestors, a way to carry them back home across the Atlantic. And I didn't mention this with the New York burial ground, but it's really important to note. I brought up water, and those bodies that were found under the construction site in the 1990s, all the bodies were buried pointed towards the east, pointed towards the continent of Africa. Here is another example. This is something, a picture from the coastal area of South Carolina, what they call the Low Country there. And this is a cemetery marker with shells and with white, so a reflective surface, another color that is representative of connecting with people in the afterlife. Shells are believed to have kept the ancestor's spirit afloat. Also, another thing to be noted here is that everyone didn't have the means and the wealth to purchase a headstone. So this was another way, a very sustainable and resilient and creative way to make a beautiful final resting place for your loved ones by using the natural resources such as shells that will be found near you. Other things that were used to celebrate and protect the loved ones in cemetery as part of this just spiritual gathering and awakening are things like face jugs. Face jugs were originally created by enslaved men who were the brick makers, and they used the leftover clay to create these jugs that they would leave at the cemetery at the final resting place to keep evil spirits away and to keep the children away so that they wouldn't take away the beautiful decorations that were left for the loved ones. Also, things like memory jugs. Here you see one covered with the experience objects, the buttons, the coins, the little knickknacks that your loved one might have embraced in their lifetime. And this is something that is covered with cement or putty, and those uh, artifacts that our loved ones would have used were applied to the spiritual jug and or the memory jug and left at the cemetery. And finally, this picture on the left is a real treasure. It is a tombstone created by Isaac Nettles in Alabama, and Isaac Nettles Sr. This was an art form that he did, and he took the faces of his children and would press those faces into sand and create a mold. And this was a headstone marker of his wife. So these are actually the faces of his children there to be with their mom at the cemetery and join her in the afterlife permanently. Just beautiful, beautiful artwork and beautiful displays of love and joy and connectivity from our ancestors to their loved ones. Now, I want to talk about something that is super near and dear to my heart as a person that loves plants and loves all things horticulture. A handful of the ornamental plants that you might find in traditional African American cemeteries. I mentioned earlier how everyone didn't necessarily have the means or the money or maybe even the ability to leave a headstone. And there were many reasons for that. There was a time where there may have only been one Black preacher man for many counties, and he had to travel to many places to do multiple funerals. So you might not have even had the funeral of your loved one at the time of their death. It may have had to been delayed. And so plants become very important as markers of graves. The picture that you see in front of you is a sketch from the late to 1800s, early 1900s of some orphans in a cemetery. And you can see the beautification that has been applied to this area where they have lost their loved one, their elder. Plants like vinca, where you have this blue reflective of the water, a way to represent important bodies of water like the Atlantic Ocean. You have colors like red, the Paul scarlet rose, the type of plants that were found in these historic African American cemeteries. Also, plants like yucca. Yucca was a plant that was believed to help the person's spirit stay in the ground. So it was a way to help the person accept their new role in the afterlife. Also to be noted, plants like you see on this slide, like gardenia. So the fragrance, the white, the evergreen, the representation of Christ and the afterlife. And very important to note is that our ancestors, many African American men and women, were the ones who went back after the Civil War and saved these heirloom plants from these antebellum mansions and started to place them at their headstones and their graves. And that's why we still have them saved today. So this is really representative of that. Just these bright, vibrant colors that have been used in these cemeteries by our loved ones. So now that we've talked about just briefly all of the ways, or some of the ways, really not all, we're just scratching the surface here today. This is such a short discussion. Some of the ways that our ancestors have connected with people in the past and how we can get back to our roots. We must do a call to action and think about how we will protect these lands and make sure that they're not erased for generations to come. So what do we mean by that? I mentioned earlier that many African Americans left the South and went to the North to seek a better life, or honestly ran for their life. And it is our responsibility, wherever we are in this country, to be each other's keeper. So the African American, the Black cemeteries that have been abandoned for whatever reason by families, these people are still our family. And we have to go back and make sure that they know that they're loved, they're not forgotten, and neither is their land. And I want to close by reminding us all of the power of Sankofa, the term from the country of Ghana, the Akan tribe. And this is really a way to plant your feet firmly in the ground, in your present, and look back to your past to understand how to operate and move forward with your future. It is okay to look to history for inspiration, for leadership, and for light, to know how to just take on the task, because it is a monumental task of protecting and celebrating and restoring these cemeteries. And we can do it, and we can do it together. And we absolutely must do it together. We absolutely are. And I'm going to repeat myself here. We are each other's keeper. We have to protect the family members of families who had to abandon their own. But they're our family now, and we can do it. I want to leave you also with a few resources. If any of this has sparked your interest, and I absolutely hope that it has, these are a few resources that can guide you and give you much more details than I would be able to share today. And most important, I hope that you are able to look at this and be able to support family Black cemeteries that have been uncovered, rediscovered, that are being renovated. Cemeteries in general, as the saying goes, are non-renewable resources. They're all unique, they're all special, and once they're gone, they're gone. And we don't want to lose any more of the stories of our ancestors. I thank you for your time today. And I would love if you would reach out to the Hamilton Hood Foundation, show them your love, your support, certainly your financial support, because it takes money and it takes time and it takes interest to protect these cemeteries. And they are one of the organizations that are leading the way and firing up that flame for the future to make sure that we are engaged and we remember our loved ones. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Yamona Pierce. Thank you, Hamilton Hood Foundation. And just make sure to support our own. I appreciate you.